World War II, Part 2, Fighting World War II. Our essential questions for this unit are: how did the unresolved issues of World War I pave the road to World War II? And how did the U.S. contribute to the Allied victory in World War II? For Part 2, Fighting World War II, the objectives will be: explain the significance of the dates 1939 to 1945 as the years of aggression of World War II and as a turning point in U.S. history. Analyze major military events of World War II, including the Battle of Midway, the U.S. military advancement through the Pacific Islands, the Bataan Death March, the invasion of Normandy, fighting the war on multiple fronts, and the liberation of concentration camps. You should be able to evaluate the military contributions of leaders during World War II, including Omar Bradley, Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, Chester Nimitz, George Marshall, and George Patton. Discuss the importance of Congressional Medal of Honor recipients, including individuals of all races and genders, such as Vernon Baker. Explain how American patriotism inspired exceptional actions by citizens and military personnel, including high levels of military enlistment, the bravery and contributions of the Tuskegee Airmen, the Flying Tigers, and the Navajo Code Talkers. Lastly, you should be able to analyze major issues and events of World War II, including the development of conventional as well as atomic weapons. As we learned in Part 1, there were a series of events which led up to the United States becoming involved in World War II. This timeline is a summary of many of those events. In the 1930s, Germany, Italy, and Japan set out to subjugate and conquer their weaker neighbors. Forced to defend their allies and themselves, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union were drawn into war against the aggressors in 1939. Inevitably, the United States joined the fighting on the side of the Allies 2 years later, after the bombing of the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. In the 2 decades following the First World War, the international political system was very unstable. The Treaty of Versailles contributed to hard feelings between the Allies and Germany, and the reparations demanded of Germany contributed to a shaky international financial system. When the world economy collapsed during the Great Depression, totalitarian leaders found enthusiastic audiences for their plans, which often included aggressive, militaristic foreign policies. When war erupted between the Allies and the Axis powers in 1939, most Americans wanted to remain neutral. Nevertheless, Franklin Roosevelt provided substantial economic aid to the Allies even before the United States formally entered the war. Because Nazi Germany was the greater threat, President Roosevelt focused on the war in Europe first. Stalin of the Soviet Union wanted the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe, but the British felt that the Americans were not prepared. American and British forces landed in North Africa in 1942 and moved to Sicily and Italy in 1943. General George Patton was one of the most successful U.S. commanders. Germany's goal in the Battle of the Atlantic was to keep food and war supplies from reaching Great Britain and the Soviet Union. President Roosevelt described the German U-boats and their crews as the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. General Dwight Eisenhower commanded the invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day. Allied troops advanced rapidly through France and retook Paris, but were surprised when Germany counterattacked at the Battle of the Bulge. After the German attack collapsed, Allied troops crossed into Germany. A military campaign of note is the Battle of the Bulge. In October of 1944, American forces made their first important conquest in Germany, Aachen, a railroad center near the Belgian border just north of the region shown on the map. This angered Hitler, and on December 16th, against his general's advice, he launched a surprise counterattack with the purpose of disrupting the Allies' supply lines, splitting their armies in two, and leading Germany all the way to Paris. The thin U.S. defenses were overwhelmed, but a total German breakthrough was avoided when U.S. troops at Bastogne put up a heroic resistance. From December 20th to the 26th, the severely outmanned U.S. garrison refused to surrender, and by the end of the siege, the German advance had been stopped. As one historian noted, the defense of Bastogne threw the whole German timetable out of gear. Bastogne, a town of about 5,000 people, was virtually destroyed, yet it was Germany that was crippled by the Battle of the Bulge, with casualties of 120,000 men. The Holocaust. Genocide is an effort to murder an entire people or nationality. Part of Hitler's philosophy was his intense hatred of Jewish people, on whom he blamed all of Germany's problems. The Holocaust refers to the attempted genocide of the Jews during World War II. After the outbreak of the war, Hitler and other Nazi leaders decided to murder all European Jews. He called his plan the Final Solution. At first, Jews were machine-gunned next to open trenches they had been forced to dig themselves, or gassed in trucks. Jews also were ordered into dismal, overcrowded ghettos, segregated Jewish areas in certain Polish cities. The Nazis sealed off the ghettos with barbed wire and stone walls. Life inside the ghetto was miserable. The bodies of victims piled up in the streets faster than they could be removed. Factories were built alongside ghettos where people were forced to work for German industry. In spite of the impossible living conditions, the Jews hung on. While some formed resistance movements inside the ghettos, others resisted by other means. They published and distributed underground newspapers. Secret schools were set up to educate Jewish children. Even theater and music groups continued to operate. When this method of extermination proved too slow for the Nazis, large concentration camps were built across Europe. Jews from Nazi-controlled countries were sent in cramped railroad cattle cars to these camps. When they arrived in the camps, most were killed with poison gas, and their bodies were burned in large ovens. Some were spared to do the work of running the camp. These inmates were half-starved and subjected to inhumane conditions. About 6 million Jews, 2/3 of those living in Europe, were killed during the Holocaust. 6 million Gypsies, Slavs, political prisoners, elderly, mentally disabled, and others also died in Nazi concentration camps. U.S. troops were shocked when they liberated the concentration camps and found the survivors of Hitler's attempt to exterminate Jews and others in the Holocaust. Shifting now from the war in Europe to the war in the Pacific. The United States fought Japan in the Pacific in this multiple-front war. After Pearl Harbor, Japan took several Pacific islands. U.S. and Filipino prisoners of war were forced to undertake a 60-mile march through the jungle, which became known as the Bataan Death March. These prisoners faced starvation, disease, exposure to the sun, and no water. About 5,000 of the Americans, almost half, died along the way. Some were bayoneted, shot, beheaded, or just left to die along the side of the road. The tide in the Pacific turned in 1943 when the U.S. Navy, commanded by Admiral Chester Nimitz, defeated a Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. Under General Douglas MacArthur, U.S. troops gradually retook the Pacific through the strategy of island hopping, eventually reaching close to Japan's home islands. One group of Americans who played a key role in the Pacific campaign were the Navajo Code Talkers. The American military needed an undecipherable code to communicate that could not be broken by the Japanese. The Navajo language is unwritten and extremely complex. By using this language, American forces could transmit messages by telephone and radio in a code that the Japanese were unable to break. President Harry Truman decided to use the new atomic bomb against Japan in order to prevent a possible 1 million American casualties if we invaded Japan, his main goal being to end the war quickly. After bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Japan surrendered. About 230,000 people were killed in both explosions combined. All wars cause a loss of life, but the Second World War was the widest and most destructive war in human history. Whereas the First World War had been the most destructive war in European history, its effects were largely limited to Europe. There was not a great deal of fighting in other parts of the world. The Second World War was fought not only in Europe, but also in North Africa, China, and Southeast Asia, as well as the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The end of the war came when Soviet troops invaded Germany from the east and other allies from the west. Hitler committed suicide in 1945. With the full extent of Nazi brutality revealed, the Allies put surviving Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity in Nuremberg, Germany. Those on trial defended themselves by claiming they had only been following orders. Many were found guilty of committing atrocities and were hanged or imprisoned. The Nuremberg trials demonstrated that individuals are responsible for their actions, even in times of war. The war ended with the rise of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Germany and Japan were occupied by Allied troops, and their leaders were tried for war crimes. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. World War II, in which over 70 million people died, was over.